Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome back. Yesterday we touched on some of the characteristics of various addictions and of addicts in general. And today I'd like to do one more list, a very short list for the adult child characteristics. And then we'll move on to affirmations and consequences. So this part of the this part of recovery is about us identifying our story, life from wherever we come from up until this point. And it's important for us to do so because, number one, gives us a sense of understanding where I've come from. And it also gives us a reference point to look back on later on, as further down in the road of recovery. We can look at, wow, look how far I've come relative to where I began. So the next couple of days are all going to be looking at bits and pieces that comprise of doing what they call the first step, or understanding your story, right? And many of us might not feel like we have a story, in part because we just know it as life, right? But when we start to dig into our family history, our abuses, our traumas, the secrets we keep, the problems we have, etc., etc., then we start to gather information from various aspects of our life as it all relates to our addiction. So this isn't just about our life story, but rather our life story relative to our addiction, more importantly our recovery. So the list for adult children of dysfunctional families, you can find this on adultchildren.org. They call it the laundry list. There are 14 characteristics, and again, just because it's phrased under adult children of alcoholics doesn't necessarily mean it's confined to alcoholics and their families. In the support groups that they run, they refer to it as alcoholic/dysfunctional families, because again, as I mentioned before, many of us may not have come from an alcoholic family, but a dysfunctional one, and the consequences are no different. So, number one, we became isolated and afraid of people and authority figures. So if you think about perhaps it's at work, perhaps it's even just within your relationships, that you find that certain people may not in fact be an authority figure, but we treat them that way, and so we see them as better than us or greater than us or having authority over us. We became approval seekers and lost our identity in the process. We are frightened by angry people and personal criticism. We either become alcoholics or addicts, marry them, or both, or find another compulsive personality trait, such as being a workaholic, to fulfill our sick abandonment needs. Now, this one's a little bit tricky because really do we acknowledge that we may have a need to be abandoned. But if you think about when engaging in addictive behavior or compulsive behavior like workaholism, that inevitably we are on some level pushing people away, and so the abandonment we experience is really by our own design. Now, really, are we going to say, no, I have a need to be abandoned? We see it as a byproduct rather than a need that we in fact try to fulfill. And if you think about, and this is why we're going to get into the history of the history of our story, is we might discover that we've experienced abandonment in various versions, whether it's actual physical abandonment where our parents left us, or whether it's just like an emotional neglect, and so they were present but we never really felt cared for, and that kind of thing. So we'll see how and where it showed up in our lives and how we might be recreating it. Then we find we live life from the viewpoint of victims, and we are attracted by that weakness in our love and friendship relationships. So it's easier to connect and be with others that we perceive as weak rather than people we find intimidating. And again, the intimidating thing ties into seeing others as authority figures. And so it reinforces this idea that we are in fact victims. And so we see life from that perspective. We have an overdeveloped sense of responsibility, and it's easier for us to be concerned with others rather than ourselves. This enables us to not look too closely at our own faults. This one, again, ironically, is easier to recognize in other people, usually because we have the story that, no, I'm doing this because I care for others, and I'm a good person, I'm trying to be a good person, etc., etc. But you may have received feedback like this from others, and if you have, perhaps use this as the opportunity to delve deeper into that feedback. And that kind of feedback usually comes from our spouses or our kids, saying like, yeah, you're always taking care of others, but when are you going to do for yourself, and when are you going to take care of yourself? And perhaps even people who support you, loved ones, or family members, like extended family members that interact with you may recognize it. We get guilt feelings when we stand up for ourselves instead of giving in to others. This one generally comes in whenever there's something that we need out of a relationship, and instead of asking for it, we just we feel guilty when we do. We don't just ask and feel okay that it's okay that we've asked. I was talking to someone yesterday who was saying that they're trying to start a business and that kind of thing, and they just can't because they don't have the time. And when we looked at it, there's an opportunity to free up some time, but the request, or what it involves, is perhaps requesting from someone else to look after their kids for an hour or two a day. And the guilt that arose from that was just so powerful that it kept her from asking. Then we become addicted to excitement. So you find people with lots going on in their lives, or lots of chaos, a whole lot of different projects are running all at the same time. That might be some version of an addiction to excitement, or leaving things for the last minute, always just being in panic mode, crisis mode. That's how that shows up. We confuse love and pity, and tend to love people we can pity and rescue. We have stuffed our feelings from our traumatic childhoods and have lost the ability to feel or express our feelings because it hurts so much. This one is very common. Generally, anyone in the helping profession will have seen some version of this when people first start out their journey, and start getting in touch with their feelings. It's such an intense experience, and they say one of the gifts of recovery is that we begin to feel our emotions, and one of the downsides of recovery is that we begin to feel our emotions, because it's all well and good when we start to feel the emotions that make us feel good, but when we start to feel things like shame and regret and remorse and that kind of thing, then those are feelings that we just want to bury all over again. We judge ourselves harshly and have a very low sense of self-esteem. We are dependent personalities who are terrified of abandonment and will do anything to hold on to a relationship in order not to experience painful abandonment feelings, which we receive from living with sick people who are never there for us emotionally. So again, the abandonment doesn't have to be physical. You could have lived in a house with 10 people and still experienced a sense of abandonment, simply because they weren't there for us emotionally. And this is a good opportunity for us to reflect, in our current households, especially now with lockdown. Do we take the time out to speak about our emotions in the home? Do we care about how the others in the house feel? Do we discuss feelings? Do we check in on an emotional level, not just what are you up to, what you're going to do now, what are you watching, but how are you feeling? Alcoholism or addiction is a family disease, and we became para-alcoholics or co-addicts and took on the characteristics of that disease, even though we did not pick up the drink. So here, this is if you think about characteristics that are passed on, sort of inherited. Very often we think of behaviors, and especially in the whole nature versus nurture discussion. There's a part of us that says, "Oh no, but I got it from my dad, or I got it from my mom," and it's the same with addiction. Just because we're not actively using, it doesn't mean we haven't inherited the behavior or the characteristics of that person. And then co-addicts, para-alcoholics, are reactors rather than actors, meaning that very rarely do we make the decision to take hold of our own destiny and to make something happen, but rather we feel that again, because we're victims, that we need to wait for circumstances to arise that are favorable, or that where we are is just a result of factors that are completely out of our control. And so we're constantly reacting, very rarely doing. And it's an interesting distinction, because one of the ways in which many people use the helping profession is relative to deficiency in their life. So if you think about someone who is perhaps in debt or overweight, it's something that they're trying to fix. And usually there's a point that a goal that they want to reach. So if 10 kg is overweight, then it's like, okay, I'd like to lose 10 kgs. But there's no considering what is it that you want to create going forward, right? If you imagine that someone is in a hole, for instance, that many people, try to fill the hole, but at the end of all of that effort are simply standing on the ground. There's nothing that they've built, there's nothing that they've created. And I encourage you to reflect on this question at this point in your recovery, which is, not just what am I trying to get rid of in my life, but what kind of life do I want to build for myself? Right. So, we're moving on. One of the reasons we look at the consequences is to bring a newfound reality to our lives as we know it. Again, as I mentioned before, many of us see addiction as a victimless crime. It's something that we're doing for ourselves or by ourselves, and here and there, maybe we see some of the consequences as, a deterioration in our relationships, or we lost a job, or that kind of thing. But there are so many consequences that we just haven't even considered. And part of the intention behind doing this exercise is for us to have a greater awareness of what the consequences of our behavior might be. If you find that you aren't the person with the addiction, but are rather living with someone or are in a relationship with someone with an addiction, then again, my appeal to you is to take heed of the consequences, because there may be consequences that you're experiencing that, again, you just perhaps haven't put a name to or haven't recognized as a consequence. So it's broken up into various categories like emotional and physical and spiritual and that kind of thing. So we'll tackle them one category at a time. The first being emotional consequences. One of the main consequences of addiction is usually an attempted suicide, or at the very least suicidal thoughts or tendencies. And this is very often because of the powerlessness that we experience, the desperation, the struggle, the feeling that even though I want to stop, I can't. And so what is the way out here? Very often, when thinking about the way out, this is a really daunting idea, because recovery and rehab has become a very lucrative industry. People charge thousands of rands or dollars or whatever currency from wherever you are for rehab. Very often this isn't just a cost-free journey, and so it's something that's going to cost an immense amount of money to someone who more than likely doesn't have it, right? Especially if the consequences of the addiction have been financial. And so more often than not, the idea is maybe I should just end it all. Homicidal thoughts or feelings. So that ties into like rage and an inability to keep our emotions in check. Extreme hopelessness or despair. Failed efforts to control the addiction or the addict. So a part of these consequences, again, are written for the co-addict or the codependent, the person in the relationship with the addict. This is a big one, feeling like two people living a public and a secret life. So on the face of it, it's we present as a certain person. So maybe we're very involved in the community. We're on the PTA of the school, or we're on the masjid board, or we are related to someone of importance, and so we need to maintain a certain facade or an exterior, but deep down inside we have a completely different struggle, and one that people don't see, or it could even be just simply hiding our addiction. And so there's a huge amount of time and energy and effort that's devoted to a set of behaviors that no one knows about. And so again, we could be the loving father or the loving mother that is secretly a compulsive gambler, or a compulsive spender, or a compulsive sex addict. And so that's another version of how we live double lives. Emotional instability, depression, paranoia, fear of going insane. A lot of those are relative to substance abuse because of a psychosis effect of long-term substance use has on the body and the brain. But even other things like just overeating, as an example, depression can be one of the consequences of that. We start to feel terrible about ourselves. We don't have a healthy way of managing our emotions, and so we start to experience despair and overwhelm. And as we gain weight, things just get worse and worse, and we spiral. And on a physiological level, they did some research, and they found that even just having a poor diet can affect your body's ability to generate feel-good hormones. And so as much as you might want to maintain a positive mindset and a sunny disposition, very often we're unable to, because we're not putting in our body what our body needs to fulfill our desire. Then loss of touch with reality. This is pretty much across the board, in part because it takes denial to maintain an addiction. We have to say things to ourselves like, what, it's not so bad, and it's not really costing that much, and I'm okay, and no one else is suffering, and whatever rationalization we use. And so in doing so, we lose touch with reality. We also, especially when seeing ourselves as the victims, especially if we use victimization as a justification to act out, then we distort reality. So someone giving us feedback on our performance, whether that is our boss or our spouse, anyone saying anything about us, we can just experience that as them being hypercritical of us, and then we feel bad. But the feeling bad, what many don't acknowledge, is that the feeling bad is really just a setup for us to have a reason to use or to act out. And so again, there's a loss of touch with reality, loss of self-esteem, we touched on that, a loss of life goals. Again, this can be tied to the increase in despair and the overwhelming preoccupation, not just in action but in thought as well, of our addiction. And so to think about life goals, like, where I want to travel, what I want to build, what I want to create, or trying to find that $1 million idea, growing my business, whatever. That becomes, while for many, it's the thing that life revolves around. Even if it's spirituality, like how to draw closer to Allah, those things then start to feel like a burden, because it takes away from the time that we could spend on our addiction. Acting against your own values and beliefs. So if you ask many addicts, the things that they did, they regret, because that's not consistent with who they were or who they wanted to be. Many people don't actually want to go around stealing or lying or cheating, but out of sheer desperation, that's what they do. And so it doesn't mean they don't have the value, but it's rather that they do, but they're powerless to enforce the value, because the addiction is stronger than their will to maintain that value. Extreme guilt and shame, that one's easy. There's a distinction here between guilt and shame, and if you read John Bradshaw's book, Healing the Shame That Binds Us, he makes a similar distinction. And the distinction being that guilt is when we've actually done something wrong. And so it's about identifying something that we've done and what the consequence is, and potentially how we can rectify that behavior, right? But guilt implies that there's an offense. Now, sometimes we feel guilty over things that we haven't actually done, right? And that's usually because we we feel shameful or experience shame. And the difference being that guilt, again, like I mentioned, is about an action. Where that shifts over into shame is when we draw a conclusion based on that action about ourselves. So, for instance, I smoke weed, and because I smoke weed, I lose track of time, and I was late for an appointment. Now, I was late for an appointment. That was the action, right? Or I smoked weed, and because of that, I was late for an appointment. Those are the actions, just the facts, all right? It's misaligned to perhaps the life I want to live, or lead rather, of being on time, being punctual, being successful, etc., etc. The conclusion that I might draw about that is that I'm a bad person, or I'm a screw up, or I'm no good, I'm useless, etc., etc. That's shame. And for the most part, shame is toxic, and it has no functional role in our recovery. If anything, it ends up being a reason that we maintain our addiction, because it makes us feel so bad, and then we seek something that is going to make us feel better. In SAA, which is Sex Addicts Anonymous, the slogan is "From Shame to Grace," and I might have mentioned this before, that sex addiction is even seen as a shame-based illness, or even an addiction to shame. They did a study, and I mentioned, under the neuroscience, that they've been doing, MRI scans and CAT scans and that kind of thing of the brain to see how it reacts, to certain emotions and certain substances and that kind of thing. And they found that much like the way the brain lights up when it's on cocaine, a similar thing happens around shame. And that is just, it's mind-blowing, because most people will say, what shame? No, who wants to feel that? That's terrible. It's disgusting. I don't want to feel that. But the reality is that on a neuroscience level, we can actually experience immense joy from it, right? I'm not saying it's a healthy thing. I'm not saying it's an unhealthy thing. I'm just pointing out what is. That the brain reacts to it in a similar way that it would to cocaine. Then strong feelings of isolation and loneliness, again, in part possibly because of the shame, or in part because, we need to isolate in order to act out. Strong fears about the future, emotional exhaustion, and then there may be other emotional consequences that we haven't covered. Right? So that's emotional. Physical, continued addictive behavior despite the risk to our health. Extreme weight loss or gain, again depending on the nature of the addiction. Physical problems like ulcers, high blood pressure. Yesterday we touched on erectile dysfunction. Physical injury or abuse by others. So if you think about someone that uses heroin, if by themselves, then it does harm to their body. Perhaps they have collapsed veins or that kind of thing. Or if you think about them being in a relationship with others, that their spouse may get them to do certain things, and they might tolerate it as a way of maintaining the relationship, because again there isn't loneliness. There's a way they now bond around the addiction, right? There's a reference is often made to a movie when it comes to heroin. They talk about this movie Requiem for a Dream. It's a very disturbing movie, but at some point one of the characters, which is the lady in the relationship, and she and significant other are both users, starts to engage in sexual acts so that they can score, right, or get their drug of choice. And so this is not a far out story. This is one that perhaps many of us have heard. Very often you'll hear it tied into cases of prostitution. That's one of the ways in which pimps maintain their hold over their ladies, which is that they keep them addicted to a certain substance, and then they become the supplier of that substance. And so, in order to continue to get their fix, they continue having to work. So that's potentially abusive or dangerous situations, right, or relationships. Vehicle accidents, again, driving under the influence. We know, what the stats are around accidents involving, drunk driving, that kind of thing. And I mean, it's a big enough problem for the government to be spending, hundreds of thousands of rands on advertising and campaigns year after year, telling people don't drink and drive, don't drink and drive, don't drink and drive. And now lately it's become, don't text and drive, or don't be on your phone, don't use your phone while you're driving. Driving while distracted is what they call it. And it's not just about texting. It's not just WhatsApp that's the problem. For instance, you have people watching porn while they're driving. There's just any number of configurations of things that we do on our phones, for instance, whether it's social media or whatever. And here, I generally don't like to, expose people's faults or draw attention to it. But, so many WhatsApp statuses, you see people recording, or you see it on the WhatsApp status, or like either Facebook story or Instagram story, recording while they're driving. And so they're recording either the, where they're driving past, or the song that they're listening to. If you ever see anyone on anyone's video, their steering wheel, it means that they are driving distracted. It means that they have their phone in their hand, and that they aren't in fact both hands on the wheel, 10 and 2 kind of thing, right? Or at the very least just not driving while engaged in doing something else. And it often I ask the question, because sometimes I'll reach out to people and say, what, I've seen your status, and it's a little bit worrying because I care for you genuinely, and I just find it concerning that you are doing this while you're driving, and they say, oh no, but I just wanted to share the song or this or whatever. And my response more often than not is simply that, how important is that song, man? How badly does the rest of the world need to hear that you heard that song, that you're willing to put your life and perhaps the lives of others at risk? So, again, with wisdom, with compassion, that kind of thing, don't just go out blasting people who are doing it, but I'm mentioning it so that we become aware of it, so that we, start to see more and more of what addictive behavior looks like and how prevalent it is around us. Then self-abuse or injury, we covered that. Sleep disturbances, very often addiction affects our sleep, usually because we're too preoccupied, or it's affecting us on a physiological level, and so maybe we take something to fall asleep, and now it means that we're too drowsy the next day, so it affects our performance, and now it takes maybe 2-3 days, a week, 2 weeks, to get back into a healthy sleep cycle. So physical exhaustion is another consequence, and then just other physical consequences relative to your addiction or codependency. And that can be like blackouts, depending on your drugs that you use, or bleeding from the nose and throat, like especially like cocaine use, vulnerability to diseases like STIs and sexually transmitted diseases, where your behavior is or your addiction is of a sexual nature. Then spiritual consequences. This one I find especially important to talk about, given that we are in the month of Ramadan. This feeling of spiritual emptiness, a disconnect from Allah, or disconnect from God, feeling disconnected even from yourself and the rest of the world. Like we've used for so long that we feel numb. We just are out of touch with our feelings. We're out of touch with what others feel. Feeling abandoned by our God, or by our higher power, by Allah. And this again ties into the whole idea of seeing life from the point of view of the victim. That if God really loved me, then why would I be suffering like this? Why would He allow me to do this to myself? Why wouldn't He just take this away? And many of us wish and pray and hope for some miraculous cure, wave of the wand, overnight recovery. But it doesn't work like that. Actually, I need to rephrase. There have been instances where, in a state of brokenness, I've heard stories of people who have turned to, whether it's directly to Allah or through a sheikh or through, whatever medium, even perhaps surrendering themselves to a program of recovery where they've just completely broken down and begged for forgiveness, begged for assistance, begged for relief from their behavior, never to return to the behavior again. But it takes a willingness, or at the very least that brokenness, to go there, to get there, to ask in that way. Because many of us, and this is the problem with process addictions, is that the consequences aren't too severe immediately. So we experience a bit of the consequences and a bit of dissatisfaction, and we really kind of hope that it's going to go away and that Allah relieves us from it, whatever. But we aren't in a state of brokenness where we desperately need or recognize that we need the recovery. And so as a result of this, we could even feel anger at our higher power, a loss of faith in anything spiritual, and then again various other spiritual consequences. And on this point, I want to mention that the use of the word spirituality here is important, because you'll find that many atheists struggle with this idea that how am I relying on a higher power or God or whatever, because I don't believe in God. And they've come to find that belief, and they've come to experience it through that surrender. Sometimes And this is usually, more often than not, what's required is that leap of faith, that willingness to engage in recovery, even though we don't necessarily fully understand the process or see the outcome, or that kind of thing. Then family and partnership consequences, the risk of losing a partner or spouse. Addiction has broken up many homes. Many of us, especially in Cape Town, will be able to testify to knowing or being affected by one family member at the very least, who struggle with addiction. Loss of partner or spouse, increase in marital relationship problems. Obviously, we're functioning in selfish, narcissistic ways, and so it's definitely going to affect our relationships. Risk to the well-being of our family. Even if you think about just the preoccupation with being on your cell phone, it means that if you have kids, for instance, you're not paying attention to what they're doing. It takes a kid like 5 seconds to climb up onto a surface that's too high for them to get down from, and somewhere they can fall from, or to grab something that should be out of their reach, or to swallow something. So even just that is a risk. Just being distracted is a risk to your family's well-being. Loss of our family or our partner's respect, again, through our actions and the consequences thereof. Increase in problems with our children. Loss of family of origin. Many times you hear stories about people who are homeless, and that they in fact have families, but they've become estranged from their families because they were at one point or the other, addict, or engaged in some sort of behavior that the families weren't happy with. Then career and educational consequences. This one's important. There's usually a decrease in productivity at work, demotions at work, loss of co-workers' respect, loss of opportunity to work in the career of our choice, drop in grades at school. And this one's important, especially for parents, because I read a thread the other day where it was a support group for people who want to come clean of pornography. And one of the people that wrote in was a 13-year-old. And at 13 years old, he's already recognized that this is a problem in his life. And he said that, I've been using pornography for the last 3 years. And, it's already having consequences, and I'm desperately trying to turn my life around. Right? And so imagine that already at the age of 13, you have someone wanting to enter a program of recovery. And more often than not, this is something that we need to recognize is potentially a problem in our community, because the reality is that with our children having access to smartphones, the average age at which someone is now exposed to pornography is between 6 and 10. Between the ages of 6 and 10, if you haven't yet spoken to your children about pornography or sex, chances are they already know about it, they've already seen it, because their friends have exposed them to it. Or, if nothing else, they've Googled. Right? They heard a word they didn't understand, didn't know what it was, and so they Googled. Right? Loss of educational or career opportunities, a loss of business. Many people have lost their businesses because of their addiction, especially when addiction really demands financially of you. Forced to change careers. I've seen people go from business owners and CEOs to taxi drivers because they now needed to start from the bottom again. A decrease in work capability or even unemployment, and then a loss of job. And then just some of the other consequences briefly. Loss of important friendships, loss of interest in hobbies or activities, having few friends who don't participate in your addiction or your partner's addiction. So generally we keep people around who allow us to maintain our addiction. Just on this loss of important friendships, one of the advices that I've seen the scholars act upon is when there are gatherings of good, like whether it's dhikr or maulid or the burda or whatever, even just classes of knowledge, perhaps even just attendance at the mosque. If there's someone that usually attends and you don't see them for a while, then ask, where are they? Try and make contact with them. See, where are they? What's going on for them? Are they ill? Is it something that they're struggling with? Even something like shame. I spoke to someone once who found that they they just couldn't bring themselves to make salah or to go to a mosque simply because of how shameful they were feeling because of their past. Not even because of anything we're doing currently. They were already clean, but the amount of shame they felt, they just couldn't bring themselves. And so it took connecting with that person and introducing that person to other Muslims and building friendships and that kind of thing to help reintegrate them into society. And so again, if there's someone that just think for a moment, I haven't seen them for a while, go out, just ask how they're doing. Perhaps even make it a practice on a daily basis. Scroll through your phone and see who of your contacts, maybe take it a letter a day and just go through your phone and see who of your contacts haven't you heard from in a while. Just find out how they're doing. Financial problems, illegal activities that even lead to arrest, jail, that kind of thing. Court or legal involvement, lawsuits, prison, stealing or embezzling to support the behavior. That one's quite common too. Or even institutionalization. So if you think about like a mental institution or an asylum, depending again on the consequences. So it just, we are pressed a little bit for time. And in the interest of time, I'd like to just read something out because the topic of today was consequences as well as affirmations. And we spoke at length about consequences, and I don't want this to seem like, it's all doom and gloom and, oh God, how are we going to rebuild from here? Because the more I look at it, the more I realize how much damage I've caused, and so where to from here. And I'd like to read out what they call the 9th step promises. And it goes like this. If we are painstaking about this phase of our development, we'll be amazed before we are halfway through. We are going to know a new freedom and a new happiness. We will not regret the past, nor wish to shut the door on it. We will comprehend the word serenity and will know peace. No matter how far down the scale we have gone, we will see how our experience can benefit others. The feeling of uselessness and self-pity will disappear. We will lose interest in selfish things and gain interest in our fellows. Self-seeking will slip away. Our whole attitude and outlook on life will change. Fear of people and economic insecurity will leave us. We will intuitively know how to handle situations which used to baffle us. We will suddenly realize that God is doing for us what we couldn't do for ourselves. These unrealistic promises? No, they are not. They are being fulfilled amongst us, sometimes quickly, sometimes slowly, but they are always happening. They will materialize if we work for them. And so I find that that little paragraph just so encouraging. If you want to Google it and stick it up somewhere, they refer to it as the 9th step promises. It's usually associated with Alcoholics Anonymous. But the words are no less true for literally anyone and everyone walking a path to purification, to self-rectification, a path of personal development. Any little change that we make is going to have an impact. And so it's important for us to recognize that even if, one of the things that I often like to encourage is to indicate to goodness, because there's a hadith of Prophet ﷺ that says that for the person who indicates to goodness or who points someone else in the direction of goodness, an equal reward is written for him, and nothing is diminished from the person that actually commits the act. So a simple thing like encouraging someone else to perform salah, you get the reward not just of your own salah but his salah as well, and he gets the reward of his salah. And so how you can do that is simply by inviting others, for instance, to listen to these lectures, to tune into DTI's Mixler, to attend whatever lectures they're able to attend classes of knowledge and gatherings, and just to engage in any sort of goodness, even if it's as simple as, I don't want to tell anyone, come listen to this thing about addiction, for instance, because what they're going to think of me, why am I listening to them, why might I be telling them? At the very least, just click share, right? Or even just click like, or just any reaction really, because it means it's going to appear on your feed, on someone else's feed. Someone is going to see it, and if they act upon it, that a reward is written for you. And I mention this because one of the du'as that we make is that Allah, through our efforts of rectification and through the da'wah that we do in helping others rectify their behavior and draw closer to Allah, we ask that Allah use that as a means to create ease and to facilitate our own rectification. So with that, I bid you Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Wa akhiru da'wana alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.